Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. The perennial issue of four-year terms for the federal parliament has recently been resurrected by supporters in the business community. Now, it was a proposal that was raised recently at a business forum, which was given some, albeit lukewarm, support by the Leader of the Opposition. Four-year terms have also been long supported by the Prime Minister and the Labor Party, and intermittently by the Coalition as well. Currently, the states all have fixed four-year terms, except for Tasmania, which has flexible four-year term. But the House of Representatives continues to have a flexible term with a maximum of 3 years from the first sitting of the House after an election. And that's set down in section 28 of the Constitution, and it requires a referendum in order to change it. The problem with 3-year flexible terms is that the government uses its first budget to pay for all the election promises that it's made to get elected, and uses its third budget in profligate spending to effectively bribe voters to vote for it at the next election, which really only leaves the second budget cycle as a time during which you could actually try to do something sensible in terms of governing for the benefit of the country. But ultimately not really enough time in order to be able to see the benefits of any hard decisions, for example, that a government might make. Essentially, governments are constantly on an election footing, and ministers are distracted by campaigning and fundraising for the vast majority of the parliamentary term, with little time actually spent on governing in the public interest. It's therefore often argued that four-year terms would allow more time for ministers to govern and develop longer-term policies to meet the public needs. Now, whether this would actually eventuate is debatable. All states have now adopted four-year terms, and in most cases fixed four-year terms, but it actually hasn't led to the kind of policy nirvana that people suggest, although it is at least arguable that the states do have a degree of longer-term planning as a consequence of their four-year terms. But there are also other arguments about the benefits of four-year terms. The first is that it would be cheaper. Elections are expensive to run. At the Commonwealth level, it runs to about $500 million, and there are considerable savings if they run every 4 years as opposed to what's currently the case, running about every 2.5 years to 3 years. Now, those savings would extend beyond the actual cost of the running of the election. There's also the cost of public funding of the political parties in order for them to campaign in the election, not to mention the amounts of money that are raised by the political parties themselves in order to run their elections. All of this could be reduced if you held those elections less often. Now, the reason why business organisations want four-year parliamentary terms is that this would bring greater economic stability and improve conditions for business. It seems that spending is depressed during the period leading up to elections because of uncertainty about which policies are going to apply in the future once the election is over. So, fewer elections are considered to be better for the business community. Election campaigns also inflame division and rancour within society, so that longer periods between elections can enhance periods of social harmony and cohesiveness. If you look at other Western democracies, the vast majority of them have either 4-year or 5-year terms for the lower house of their legislatures, and this is because they too consider that an electoral cycle of 2 to 3 years is just simply too short in order to achieve good governance. So, would a referendum on this be likely to win? The primary argument against extending parliamentary terms is that this reduces the frequency of accountability of politicians to the voters. A bad government can run for longer before facing the verdict of the people. 4 years is obviously longer than 3. Now, the simplistic arguments that would be run in such a campaign would be, on the one hand, you'd have people saying well, if you have fewer elections or a greater period of time between elections, you have less hassle and less aggravation for the people to cope with. People do not enjoy, as a general principle, election campaigns. On the other hand, however, you would have people saying, well, this proposal would make politicians less accountable. It would reduce the power of the people to chuck them out if they're a bad government. And that's obviously going to be a powerful argument that will resonate with many people. But beyond those basic arguments, there are much greater complexities at the federal level that need to be faced with such a proposal. The devil, as always, is in the detail. The first question is whether this would simply be an expansion of a flexible term of Parliament from a maximum of 3 to 4 years, or would it involve putting in place fixed 4-year terms? Now, fixed terms have many advantages. They're fairer because they take away the discretion of the Prime Minister to choose to hold the election at whatever time most benefits the government. And they also remove from the hands of the Prime Minister a weapon that they can use against their own party, and that is, if the party is behaving in a way the Prime Minister doesn't like, the Prime Minister can threaten to hold an election which would put the members of the party's seats at risk. And you might remember Malcolm Turnbull actually did contemplate going to Yarralumla and asking the Governor-General for an election while Malcolm Turnbull's leadership was under siege at the time by Peter Dutton. In the end, he decided not to do it, but it was a power that he did have. Fixed-term elections are also fairer because they allow all political parties to plan and budget for an election on a particular date. So they have all their policies and their candidates in place ready in a timely fashion, and importantly, they can budget to raise the relevant campaign funds over a 4-year period and not be caught out. Candidates would also know when they will need to be free to be able to campaign, and they can plan their work and other commitments around that period. Fixed terms also give certainty to business, so businesses can factor elections into their planning, and importantly to public servants as well, because they then can ensure that all important contracts and appointments are dealt with before you enter into the caretaker period. All up, taking the uncertainty out of election timing does allow for more orderly planning and is fairer. And that's indeed why all the states, except for Tasmania, have introduced fixed 4-year terms. Fixed 4-year terms, however, bring with them some rather awkward questions about the upper house and the reserve powers of the Governor-General. Should a fixed term cycle be able to be disrupted by the holding of a double dissolution election when there is a conflict between the two houses? Or should we remove the whole double dissolution procedure altogether? What happens if there is a fixed 4-year term and the Senate blocks supply? Or if there's a vote of no confidence that's passed in the government? Do you allow for exceptions to the fixed term in these circumstances, as the states have done? And if so, what is the role of the Governor-General? Does the Governor-General get to choose whether to appoint a new government without an election or to hold an election instead? And what happens to the reserve power to dismiss the government? And most critically, do you really want to be arguing about these things during a referendum campaign? Then there's the even worse problem of Senate terms. Now, at the moment, the Senate has a fixed 6-year term with half the Senate going up for election every 3 years. Now, this is set out in section 13 of the Constitution, and it can only be changed by referendum. While the term is fixed, the election date is flexible within the year preceding the fixed turnover date, so that ordinarily a government can engineer things so that its election for the House of Representatives is held at the same time as the half Senate election. But what do you do when a fixed or flexible 4-year term exists when it doesn't coincide with the 3-yearly half Senate elections? The two main options are to expand the Senate term so that it runs for 8 years, with half the Senate being elected every 4 years, or to reduce the Senate's term to 4 years, with the whole of the Senate being elected at the same time as the House of Representatives. Now, both of these options have their problems. An 8-year term would be regarded by many people as too long. This is especially so if the person is elected as a representative of a particular party with particular policies, and then in year 1 ditches the party and the policies and then continues for another 7 years doing precisely what they want without any accountability whatsoever to the electorate. Many people would balk at that. Opponents would campaign and say, well, look, this was simply a job security racket for politicians. You can imagine how that argument would be run. On the other hand, reducing the term of the Senate to 4 years, while making it more accountable on the one hand, would take away its status as a continuing House and might be seen, as indeed was argued in the 1988 referendum, as reducing its power to the detriment of the states. Moreover, because the Senate is elected by proportional representation, it would reduce the quota for election to the Senate by half, with the consequence that far more independents and minor parties would end up being elected, potentially making it even more difficult for governments to pass legislation. Now, some might argue this is a good thing, making the Senate more representative, having diverse views, making it more a house of review in terms of stopping governments going ahead with things. But others would strongly be opposed to it on the basis that it disrupts the ability of government to govern. Now, in 1988, the Hawke government did put a referendum to the people about 4-year terms. And in this case, the proposal was for flexible 4-year terms, so a maximum of 4 years, for the House of Representatives, with the whole of the Senate being elected each time there was a House of Representatives election. Now, this avoided any interference with the powers of the Governor-General because the terms were not fixed. The Senate could still block supply, but if the consequence of that was the holding of an election, then the full Senate would face that election too. It also meant that the Prime Minister would retain the power to request the holding of an election at a time suiting his or her political benefit, well before the 4-year period was reached. Now, the Yes case in the referendum campaign argued that this change would spare the public the disruption of too many elections, provide the convenience of holding elections on the same day, result in responsible long-term government planning, allow business to plan and invest with more certainty, and save on the cost of holding elections. So many of the arguments I've already given you. The Yes case also noted that since 1945, there had been on average an election every 2 years. Now, the No case argued that it would not mean fewer elections, as the Prime Minister could still call early elections whenever he or she wished. It claimed that it would radically change the parliamentary system by abolishing the Senate's fixed term and the rotation of senators, and that it would cripple the Senate's independence, turning it into a rubber stamp and silencing the independent voice of the smaller states. It argued that it would allow the government to push laws through the Senate under the threat of an early election, and it would allow the government to ignore the people from the smaller states. And it concluded by saying this: there is more to this proposal than meets the eye. It has hidden and dangerous consequences which would forever remove the essential checks and balances in our democratic system of government. It means more power for the Prime Minister and the government and less power for the states. No more power to Canberra, vote no. Well, you can hear the resonance in that kind of a campaign statement, and you can just imagine it being said in relation to any future referendum on this subject as well. Now, despite the fact that the Senate has not really functioned as a state's house since well, forever. And that senators instead vote in the Senate along party lines rather than state lines. This argument still proved effective back in 1988. Only 32.91% of people voted in favour of this 4-year terms proposal, with 67.09% of people voting against it. So, are we likely to hold a referendum on 4-year terms in the near future? There are, as I've just explained, many diabolical choices that would have to be made in the formulation of that referendum proposal, and it would open the door again to massive scare campaigns, which we know tend to be effective. So it seems to me unlikely that anyone's actually going to put in the effort to run this campaign. Thank you for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and I look forward to you joining me again next time. Goodbye.